Group. The Labour Group declined the offer, feeling that it would impact on proportionality. And so we are one member short of the committee today through an apology. I note that we haven't got Councillor Baker with us as well. I haven't had an apology from her, so if she is on her way, she will be able to join the meeting in due course. In terms of officers present, I've got Janie Berry on my left here, who's the Director of Governance and Monitoring Officer. And then we've got some officers just down to my left-hand side down on the table. So we have Francis Harrison, who's Head of Legal Services. We have James Gilchrist, who is the Director of Transport, Environment and Planning. And we have Darren Hobson, who is Traffic Management Team Leader. The way that this meeting is going to work today is going to be slightly different than previous meetings of this committee when we're hearing call-ins. We're in a slightly unusual situation that the call-in came in under the old constitution, but we're now operating under the newly adopted new constitution. So there might be a couple of points where there'll be a divergence from what we would be doing in every future meeting when new call-ins come in under the new constitution. When we reach those points, I'll just flag them up. And I have got a handy sort of cheat sheet here, which is going to be guiding me on the way through, because we are doing things in a very slightly different way than we've done call-ins previously. So with that said, I'll move us on to the principal agenda now. So agenda item 1 is declarations of interest. Does anybody have anything that they need to declare in relation to this evening's meeting? Nope. And so on to agenda item 2, which is public participation. I've just realised that in my haste, I've forgotten to do my basic housekeeping, which is we're not expecting a fire alarm. There are people in the room who might not know the building. So if you do hear the fire alarm go off, you leave the building by the way in which you came into the building. Toilets are behind us, and please make sure you got your mobile phones turned off or on silent. So with that said, agenda item 2 is public participation. So we have in the room Mr. Stephen Macy. If you'd like to come up to the table, please. And as I've explained to you already, you have 3 minutes to address the committee. I will give you a shout if you're getting up to sort of 2.5 minutes, you've got 30 seconds left. And the committee won't be able to ask you any questions, but they will make note of any points that you raise if they feel that they need to find any further information. So over to you.
Good evening. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak today. I'm Steve Macy. I'm a resident of Osbaldwick, grew up around Town Hall, and value the opportunity to talk to you all tonight. My points I'd like to try and get across are quite limited, focused on 2 key issues, but they do go mainly, in my opinion, to the heart of what's happening. So my focus is relating to the displacement of parking from the university. And my first point that I'd like to make is about the planning. So the original historic planning for the university, to the best of my knowledge, didn't have a pay to park arrangement. The current arrangement does. Now, I've checked through all 249 planning applications that are evident to me, and I couldn't see any legality of what they're doing. And just to put that into perspective, I did a bit of a quick rule of thumb calculation. That's about £1 million every 10 years in terms of income. So the second part was about whether the capacity was there at the university causing the overspill. And we have open correspondence from the university from 10th of May saying it's not about the capacity, it's about students and staff unwilling to pay. Those 2 things combined push the parking and all related environmental matters onto the public highway. So my point that I'd like you to try and consider, please, as part of this calling in, we're looking at all the solutions, but not the problem. And I'd like to see the actual legality of that. And I think it's fundamental before you can actually make any decisions as to what we implement on the highways, we deal with the actual source of the problem. That's my point.
Thank you very much, Mr. Macy. That's well within your time. I think you said to me you thought 2 minutes, you're spot on 2 minutes, so that's perfect. Thank you very much. You're very welcome to stay and watch from the public gallery at the back of the room there. We then have a second public speaker who is calling in on Zoom. So we have a Ms. Amy Reynolds. So Ms. Reynolds, are you able to hear me? If you could just sort of acknowledge that you're there?
Yes, can you hear me? I'm just trying to turn my video on.
That's fantastic. We can hear you nice and clearly. So as with Mr. Macy, you have 3 minutes to address the committee, and I'll just give you a shout if you're running out of time. So over to you.
That's great. Thank you for letting me address this committee today. I'm here today to express concerns at the lack of consultation and consideration given to the residents by the council in relation to the implementation of parking restrictions in Cavendish Grove and Tranby Avenue. The parking problem has been created by the introduction of the Badger Hill Res Park scheme, which the council didn't seem to have the foresight to see that this would impact us in the surrounding areas, and therefore did not consult with those who are now affected by it. Yes, there is a safety concern on Tranby Avenue with cars parking all the way along the street on the bend, and you can't see the oncoming traffic. However, there wasn't an issue up until the Badger Hill Res Park scheme was introduced. The proposal of double yellow lines halfway down the small 10-house cul-de-sac of Cavendish Grove has no impact on safety. It only moves the parking problem further into our street, causing the issues with getting on and off your driveway. I've submitted a letter to Darren Hobson signed by the residents of Cavendish Grove to show that collectively we do not wish to have the proposed parking restrictions implemented in our road, nor do we want residents parking. I firmly believe that it's all part of a master plan by the council to introduce residents parking in all areas and make money from council tax paying residents. You introduce it in one area, the problem moves on to the next, and so on. Most of the cars causing the issues in our area are not residents and are left for days, if not weeks on end. I've challenged some of the car owners who have told me they are students who live in Badger Hill but haven't been given car parking permits by their landlords. One driver parked on our street for approximately 2 months was unable to drive away because his brakes seized, most likely because it had been stood for so long. On his attempt to leave, he filled the street with tyre smoke and then churned up the grass verge for 5 minutes until I asked him to stop. He now parks permanently on a path a couple of streets away. This is just one example of what we residents are having to put up with as a result of your decisions. Some potential solutions, in my opinion, would be to allow free use of the university car parks on the Heslington East car parks that are practically empty, or offer enough free permits to the student HMOs in Badger Hill. My concern is that come the end of the free permits, Badger Hill residents decide not to continue with the Res Park scheme, but we are left with permanent double yellow lines, which will be irreversible. Therefore, I feel implementing the parking restrictions is knee-jerk and too premature. Consultation is the process of discussing something with someone in order to get their advice, gather information, and obtain their opinion about it. This hasn't happened in this case. Your idea of consulting is to send a letter out, ignore people's opinions, and fail to obtain the information on what the problem is. Perhaps if you listened to the residents, came out and spoke to them, you may be able to find a better solution that works for all. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was spot on 3 minutes. I thought you were drawing to a close, so I didn't give you the warning there. But thank you very much for your time this evening. And obviously, you'll be able to continue watching on the YouTube, and you'll see how the meeting unfolds. I've made a couple of notes of some of the points that you've raised there.
Thank you. Cheers.
Okay, so we now move on to agenda item 3, which is to approve the minutes of previous meetings. It's actually in some respects quite fortuitous that one of the sets of minutes relates to this call-in some respects, because you will recall that we had 2 call-ins in one day, and one of them was on a very similar topic. I think we will just have to be a little bit careful during this meeting that we don't stray into trying to re-discuss that call-in and stick to the points of this call-in. But as I say, it's helpful to have them there in the agenda pack. So if I can just see if anybody has any objections or any points that they want to change, or otherwise are happy for us to sign the minutes that relate to the first meeting on the 9th of May, which is on page 1. Everybody happy that they're a fair and accurate record? Yeah. And then the second meeting on the 9th of May, which is at page 5, I just have a couple of things that I think we need to note. Has anybody else picked up anything within the minutes that they're wanting to address? No. So the points I just wanted to address was that I've checked back on the footage. Councillor Baker left the meeting before the vote was taken. So she left at around about 8 PM, if that could just be inserted. And then the vote itself was split 4 votes to 3. And we've been recording the way that those votes have been split. So again, if we could just amend it to reflect that. And then I'm happy to sign both of those minutes if everybody else is happy with that. Yeah, Brill. So I'll then move us on to agenda item 4, which is the principal meeting point of the meeting this evening. So this is the called-in item. So as I said in the introduction, this call-in relates to decisions that were taken on the 17th of May. You can see the decision sheet at page 13 of the agenda pack, and then the report that relates to that at page 15 of the agenda pack. The way that the call-in is going to work today, as I say, we're operating in a slightly different way than we have done previously. So I'll be inviting the calling-in members to come and address the committee. They'll have a maximum of 10 minutes to address the committee, and then committee members have the opportunity to ask them questions. I'll then invite the exec member to come and address the committee. They have a maximum of 10 minutes to address the committee. And then again, we'll invite questions from members. We'll then invite the officers to answer any technical questions that may have been raised in either of those 2 presentations or in any of our questions. I have asked James Gilchrist that if there's anything that is a sort of a black and white case, rather than us spending time discussing something that he can give a straight answer to, not that he doesn't give straight answers all the time, of course, but if it's a simple yes/no type answer, he's just going to flag to me rather than us sort of going around the houses on things. Once we've done all of that, and this is where it is different than we've previously done, the lead signatory of the calling in will be invited back to the table to summarise their case in light of everything that they've heard. The exec member will then be invited back to summarise their position, their case in light of everything that we've heard, and then members will discuss it. And I'll be going around each of you in turn, asking you which way you feel the calling needs to go and what your reasons or grounds are for that. We then take a vote, and then that draws us to the end of the meeting. That's where it will be slightly different this time, because we're under the new constitution, but with an old call-in. So we are still going to go to an A/B vote, as we would have done under the previous constitution at that point, because it was felt that that was the best way to handle the call-in as it's come in. On all future call-ins after this meeting, we'll then be doing something slightly different at that point, around looking at breaches and looking at how the call-in is either upheld or otherwise. So I'm not going to go into that right now. When we get to the next time there's a call-in, we'll do that in detail, but I just want to be clear that we're sort of in a slightly halfway house this evening. So with all of that said, if I could invite the 2 calling in members who are present, that's Councillor Rowley and Councillor Waters, if you could come to the table. And I don't mind who goes first, but between the 2 of you, you have 10 minutes to set out your case to the committee. And then once you're done, as I say, committee members may wish to ask you some questions.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd just like to apologise to committee members for another call-in meeting, largely dealing with the same issues raised and considered on the 9th of May. It's very useful to have those minutes in along with tonight's agenda, and I'd like to refer you back to that meeting and the minutes on page 3. Specifically, the so-called concession offer made by the executive member for transport and the bullet points at the foot of the page. Given the petition request was to solve the university-related parking problem, not simply to move it, I was disappointed that the committee accepted most of the proposals, but you accepted giving the executive member and officers time to engage with the university and Archbishop Aldgate School to cut problem parking. There was supposed to be high-level consultation between this council and the university over this matter, including ward councillors. We as ward councillors have heard nothing. This committee accepted those proposals in good faith, and then, in a clear demonstration of how the executive members and officers had deceived you as to their faith or supposed commitment to earlier committed actions, 8 days later voted to ignore the public consultation on waiting restrictions and daub Tranby Avenue and the junction of Cavendish Grove with double yellow lines. If I was sat around the table as a scrutiny committee member, I'd be furious at such actions by the executive member and officers under his direction. They're just sticking 2 fingers up to this committee and process. But worse, yet again, it's a so-called public consultation that this council ignores, reinforced, I might add, by the objection letter from all council tax-paying residents in Cavendish Grove, and you've heard from their representative tonight. Double yellow lines don't solve a problem, they merely move it. Double yellow lines have been rejected by a clear majority of the residents in the immediate area. The executive member decision session of the 17th of May should be referred back to executive with a recommendation that the double yellow parking restrictions are deferred pending the outcomes of the 9th of May actions the executive member and officers undertook to yourselves. The final proposal on page 3 was for a commissioned scrutiny meeting to take place within 6 months to examine the university section 106 agreements or the travel plan. Pursuit of these unwanted double yellow line parking restrictions is clearly a face-saving exercise for those involved in creating the problem in the first place. And in terms of the problem, please do not let these people tell you it's all about safety. As at the moment, the problem's dissipating naturally as the university term comes to an end. There's plenty of time to deal with the promised actions before there's any safety concerns later in the autumn. As for the other double yellow line proposal that has been caught up in all this, the Osbaldwick Lane proposal, there's no need for that either. It's a corner whereby any parking within 33 foot of the junction is an offence North Yorkshire Police can and will, if notified, deal with. It's also part of an area soon to be subject to a full review of the parking situation, so there should be no piecemeal actions in the interim. Committee should recommend to executive that the Osbaldwick Lane restrictions are also deferred pending the full consideration of parking issues between Tanghall Lane and the Osbaldwick parish boundary on Osbaldwick Lane. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Waters and Councillor Rowley.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I genuinely believed, and possibly in my naivety, that the 9th of May was a watershed. That actually we came to a resolution as a committee working with the executive member and with officers that actually we could have found a way forward that didn't require the committee to make decisions and send information back and send decisions back. I thought we'd actually come to a really good consensus. And I was expecting consultation with officers. And sadly, as my colleague has mentioned, we've had no communication from said officers in the 6-7 weeks since that particular 9th of May meeting. And that has saddened me. I would say that I absolutely uphold the rights of the ward councillors to respond to their residents, whether that be a residents parking scheme, whether that be a petition, whether that be a cat rescue zone, whatever it might be. If you consult with your residents, then as elected members, you come to propose something, I'm more than comfortable with that. So the implementation of a resident parking scheme in Badger Hill, I know was consulted on widely by the ward councillors, and it was a response by the residents in that particular ward. There was no consultation with us in a neighbouring ward and no forethought to what might happen if that would be implemented. I also accept that the Moor Avenue is not in our ward either. And if the elected members who are around this table for that particular ward wish to take that further, then that's entirely up to them. I can only talk about the issues that are in my ward, which is the Tranby Avenue, Cavendish Grove. The report talks about consultation with residents. And to me, consultation isn't sending a letter and hoping that somebody will respond. You've got, upwards of nearly 50, 60 houses and residents along Tranby Avenue and Cavendish, and you got replies. You had 15 replies that were not happy with the decision and 4 that were. To me, that's not consultation. One of the things that I do as an elected member, and I know many of you members do as well, is you actually go and knock on the doors and you talk to the residents and you understand what they want. They are frustrated about the parking. They are frustrated about the fact that there is no consultation. There's never been a public meeting. There's never been an invitation by officers to come into the ward and have a public meeting with us to discuss a way forward. Simply imposing double yellow lines is not the way forward. There are are other ways that can be looked at. And we agreed on the 9th of May that we would do that we'd sit down with officers and we'd look at how we can move this forward. Sadly, that has not happened. This decision simply imposes double yellow lines in an area that actually doesn't need double yellow lines, and all it will do is just move the problem further into Cavendish Grove and further along Tranby Avenue. This needs to go back to the executive member. He needs then to instruct officers to have a proper dialogue with us as the elected members and with the residents that live in Tranby Avenue to find a solution that works for all. Thank you.
You're still within you've got another couple of minutes if you want in terms of your opening remarks.
It was just for clarity. I mean, having two of the old road councillors here, the only reason I commented on the Morav Osbaldwick Lane proposals was because I was mistakenly invited to comment on them when the proposals first came out by the officers. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been mentioned or brought up in this.
Okay. Thank you. So thank you both for your opening remarks. There's obviously a number of points that have been raised there, and I'll invite committee members to ask you any questions from there. Obviously, it's disappointing to hear what you're saying about lack of engagement since the 9th of May meeting. I think what we do just need to be clear about, I've said it already, but I think just in terms of guiding the committee and in terms of how we're dealing with this today, if we think that there are problems with the concessions that were made on the 9th of May, I think they're things that we can't necessarily deal with this evening in terms of the way that this discussion on this particular decision goes, although I understand that they are very closely linked. I think from recollection on the 9th of May, the one part that we specifically left out was the double yellows at this location, because we knew it was coming to an exec member decision. And I think that there was a point made that, you know, we would hope that there'd be some conversation in advance of that meeting, and you know, that the decision would be one that would reflect both what the residents, what the ward members, and what the exec member and officers you know, needed to see happened. And I'm sure that we'll be asking officers for the technical issues around the safety, because I know the point that you're making, Councillor Waters, around whether there is or isn't a safety issue. Again, from recollection from the 9th of May, one of the reasons why we left that specific decision out of any of our sort of summary and concessions was around the fact that there was potentially a safety issue, and that would be best dealt with in that decision session. So with all of those points made, if members around the table have any questions that they wish to ask of any of the calling in members, if you could just indicate now. Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to, I suppose, understand the nature of the issue that prompted the double yellow line proposal in the first place. So, leaving to one side why those cars are parking there, bottom end of Tranby into Cavendish. So setting aside where those cars have come from, and I take, you know, hear what you're saying about displacement from Badger Hill. What, in your mind, what are the issues that the nature of the parking in that location is causing? If it isn't a safety issue, what is the issue in your mind in terms of the concerns that either must have been raised at some point, whether it's by officers, whether it's by residents, whether it's by members, just to fill me in on a bit of the
Thank you for that, Councillor Fenton. So essentially, cars were being parked at the start of the residential house. If you look on your map, you see on the left-hand side the start of the residential housing. Again, I don't want to cast any aspersions, but that is a house of multiple occupation, and there were people living in that house that were parking on the verge and were making it difficult for vehicles to move around it. And again, in terms of consultation, I actually went and spoke to the residents, said, please, be mindful of the fact that there are other people that live here, that you're churning up the verge, that you're making it difficult for other cars to move. And then for a very short period, it seemed to be okay, but then the parking problem came back. And I think it's probably been a bit of a reaction, a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, dare I say, by the officers to think, well, what we can do if we put double yellow lines in, then they can't park there, because you'll see the double yellow lines go 2 or 3 houses down and then into Cavendish Grove. So that may well have been what prompted the officers to think about the double yellow lines. But again, I come back to the lack of consultation. Neither has there been any discussion with any resident or with any elected member about the possibility of putting single yellow lines down, which would actually be restricted parking from, say, 9 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon or something like that. Again, there's lots of potential options that have not been looked at and not been discussed, but hopefully I've answered your question.
Councillor Fisher.
Thank you, Chair. I think Councillor Waters mentioned that the police will enforce against cars parked close to junctions. Well, bearing in mind I've probably reported 45 to 50 in the last year, I've never had a single successful visit from the police in that time. I've either died of boredom trying to get through on 101, the cars moved before they've actually got here, if they were ever coming, or they're just simply not attended. So on that evidence, how many times have you managed to get cars moved on junctions? Because you may have some magic I don't have.
It probably depends on who you contact and how you contact them. I certainly wouldn't want to waste a minute longer than what I ever had to do on 101. But I usually email it with photographic evidence, and I can send you photographs of police out actually measuring the distance from cars parked close to junctions, because they know it's a problem and they also know who's created this problem. It's a shame that the police are having to waste time on it, but they do come out. And I particularly, it's somewhere in this agenda or probably the last call in, there was reference to the police not doing this, which I find quite offensive, given that the police do assist us when we don't get any assistance from the council.
So I suppose one of the questions that I had, which perhaps links to this, if it's an offence to park within whatever it is, 32 feet, I think it was, of a corner or a junction, and a car couldn't park there anyway, what difference would it make if there was double yellow lines there or not? Why would it be a problem to have double yellow lines there if you can't park there anyway under the highway code?
Because there's no double yellow lines, people can think that they can get away with it. You put double yellow lines down, if people actually avoid that corner, all you're doing is moving the problem somewhere else. The actual safety problem at the moment created by this council, by the displacement of the university-related parking, is further down the road, as anybody that lives there knows.
But I suppose the thing that I'm just sort of trying to get my head around within this, and I think there's probably another point which I will ask the officers to clarify around, if there's no double yellow lines there, the police would come as an obstruction. I think if there are double yellow lines there, then you can have traffic enforcement officers as well. So it gives you a second bite at the cherry. Now we can talk about how effective that is or isn't. That's a sort of second thing, but I'm just trying to understand. And I totally get that if the double yellow lines extend beyond the area that you wouldn't be allowed to park under the highway code, I totally get that then is pushing traffic further away. But if we're saying that you can't park that close to a junction and you would call up the police and ask them to move the car somewhere else, presumably they could just move the car further down Cavendish Grove or wherever else it is. I don't quite understand why having double yellow lines there is a problem if you can't park there anyway, and it gives you more tools to enforce that.
My perception of this is that the double yellow lines are the starting gun for a residence parking scheme. It's the first action of the council. Then when people say, well, all it's done is move a problem, they will say, well, we'll put another stretch of double yellow lines, which won't solve it, it'll move the problem. Then it'll be residence parking scheme as promoted by the executive member for transport, who seems determined to cover all of York in these schemes.
So I think and again, this is where I'm just trying to keep it. I will come to you in a moment, Councillor Rowley. I think this is where I'm just trying to keep us focused in this particular call-in on this particular subject, because I think the points that you're making around the creep of Res Park, I absolutely recognise that it's something that happens in my ward enormously, and we can say very, very easily, as soon as this Res Park goes in, we know that we'll start getting emails from the next street, and as soon as the next street gets its Res Park, we know it'll be the next one. I think some of that was addressed in terms of, I accept that it may not have happened yet, but in terms of the concessions that were made on the 9th of May about that bigger picture discussion, that was the point of that call-in a way. On this one, on this particular issue, I'm just trying to understand where the nub of the issue around this particular decision. I will come to you in a second, Councillor Rowley, because what I wanted to sort of pick up from the both of you really was something that the public speaker on Zoom mentioned, and I think you mentioned, Councillor Rowley, about that there hadn't been a discussion around single yellows as a possible way of disrupting long-term parking. And I'm just wondering if you have a sense between you of whether there might be any sort of combination of singles and doubles that you think might work better to deal with some of the issues, or whether this is just about, I don't wish this to be happening because you see it as a first step on a slippery slope, or however we're framing it.
But surely these are all the discussions that should have been had with the concessions that you accepted on the 9th of May. It's all the things that should have been, we've not heard a thing from officers.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, in answer to your initial question about whether the WL lines were there or not, and the illegality of parking in certain places. So what you'll see is on page 24 of your report is where the planned WL lines would go, and if you look, they go from the junction. So if you look all along where the WL lines are, not all of that is legally enforceable at the moment if somebody parks in one or two of the houses that are in where the proposal for the WL lines go. Okay, so it's not so to simply say if you had WL lines, they couldn't park there, they can't park there now because of an illegality. That simply isn't the case. There are certain times of the day where people will park and then we'll leave their cars for a day and go off and do whatever they need to do. And they park inconsiderately, and it causes problems, which is the kind of number where we're at the moment. And where they go to, you can surmise that yourself. But there are other times, maybe during weekends and holidays, where residents have people dropping off, so childcare, for example, people that come to look after elderly residents that are there, healthcare professionals that come and need to park, and they will park responsibly at the moment where they can. They're prohibited from doing that on a Monday to Friday because of the indiscriminate parking of people that don't live there. So putting WL lines down, yes, would stop the illegality at certain junction points, but there are certain points along that route where essential workers, childcare, people that literally come and go within 5 or 10 minutes couldn't park on the days where it isn't an issue or it isn't a problem. So the implementation of WL lines for us actually is the thing that we would be against, because we think there are other solutions. And we come back to the nub of what we said right at the beginning, is there's been a phenomenal lack of dialogue and discussion, and that I genuinely believe, and so myself and my colleague disagree, because I actually think single yellow lines might be a solution, and I respect my colleagues' view that they wouldn't be. But from my point of view, WL lines is not the answer for that reason.
Thank you, that's helpful. I had James flagging at me, and I'd asked him only to intervene if it was something that was a technical.
Just to clarify what's decided, if you look at page 24 of your pack of papers, there is the map in there that I think Councillor Rowley is referring to, which was what was advertised as the proposed traffic regulation order. But if you then go to the decision by Councillor de Gorn and the recommendations by officers, it was not to implement that, it was just to implement the junction protection. So it is literally, I've prepared a handy plan, or Darren has, it is literally the junction there and the junction there. The decision wasn't to implement those bits down there. So we implemented a lesser traffic regulation order.
And I'll come to you in 1 second, Councillor Rowley. So just to be completely clear then, so on this map, you've got the markings that show 15 metres. To be honest, I want to try and describe it just for anybody who's watching, because obviously it's helpful for us to have a copy, but I'm conscious that there is certainly at least one public speaker who is watching the webcast. So on the map on page 24, it shows the limits of 15 metres from the junction, say at the Cavendish Grove junction on Tranby Avenue. Yeah. So I'm guessing that 15 metres is around about 32 feet, possibly a little bit more than. Yeah. So have we gone to the full 15 metres under this?
No, we advertised 15, yeah, and we're proposing 10.
So okay.
In terms of junction protection.
And I will come to you in a second, Councillor Rowley. So 10, and so is it 10 metres from each junction on these two junctions here? Is it?
No, it's 10 metres. It's 10 metres from the Cavendish Road junction.
Yeah. In all directions.
In the two sides, but not on the far side. Yeah. Of Tranby Avenue, and 20 metres at the junction at the bottom.
Okay.
And they're obviously not contiguous in the way they are in the original proposal. And
so then that leaves a section in between that is no lines, no restrictions currently. And okay, so
described as just the two junctions with none of the other side.
Yeah. Okay. So for the benefit of anybody watching, then the opposite side of Tranby Avenue to the Cavendish Grove junction has no double yellow lines to be implemented beyond a section that runs from the Hull Road roundabout 20 metres into Tranby Avenue. Okay. Hopefully that was clear. Councillor Rowley.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I am just exasperated that here we are in a CSMC call-in and the officers have documents that we've not had sight of. They can argue all day that this was what decided at the decision session. We've had no information sent to us as the elected members. You, as committee members, don't have these documents in front of you. If they were that important, surely you should have had those documents beforehand, and we should have had them as well. I understand what they say, that this was the decision session, but again, it just shows the lack of consultation and the lack of dialogue, not just with myself and my ward colleague, but also with residents. And I think, again, it just shows you that, you know, there's an awful lot more that could and should be done.
Waters.
And just to be clear, after that, you had somebody speak from Cavendish Grove. You've had the letter from all the residents at Cavendish Grove. Most of them watched the decision session on the 17th of May. Most of them understand this ridiculous concession, and they've completely rejected it. And the second point I would ask is, what are the officers hoping to achieve other than, as I mentioned, a face-saving exercise by implementing these double yellow lines, even in the restricted areas that they're now, well, that was passed on the 17th. Okay. Whether the officer wants to answer that.
Well, I don't want to bring the officers into answering that at the moment, but we will obviously have an opportunity to ask the officers questions about the technicality of the decision, and the decision maker will be obviously coming up as well to answer questions. And I do absolutely take your point and hear your frustration around the consultation and information, you know, as available. And as I say, I think certainly one of the things that is difficult sometimes for everybody involved is making sure that information is disseminated as quickly and as openly as it can be. And so I think sometimes it's a difficult balance between it being helpful actually to have the clarity around where the lines are and aren't being drawn and those sorts of things. But you know, certainly I read the papers and was working on the assumption that we were looking at the map on page 24 as being where things are. Although I do note and I'm sure officers will also explain this, that when you advertise for any sort of traffic regulation order, there are rules about where you can draw back from, but not extend beyond, if you see what I mean. So you can sort of say, we're thinking of doing 20 metres, but we're only going to implement 15. But if you're thinking of doing 20 metres, you can't then implement 25, I think is the correct way around. I think, unless anybody has any further questions, sorry, Councillor Hollier, do you want to ask a question?
Well, I guess it's now, knowing now what we know now, does that sort of solve the issue?
Sorry.
Thank you, Councillor. It doesn't for me, because all it shows is that what was promised, and I'm very careful I don't kind of hook everything on the 9th of May meeting. What was promised was a consultation and dialogue that has not happened. The implementation of the yellow lines, wherever you would put them, if it's for safety, it's pointless, because we have had situations where both myself and Councillor Waters have called the police, and they have come and they have taken action for cars that are parked illegally. So the implementation of the yellow lines will make no difference to us. It is part of a wider required consultation to look at how we can best put in place something that fits for everybody, and just simply putting a couple of double yellow lines on certain corners, for me, it doesn't answer the question, and it doesn't solve the issue.
Councillor Waters.
And again, don't forget, page 3. A commission scrutiny meeting would take place within the next 6 months to examine whether the Section 106 agreements or the travel plan with the university before consideration by the executive. You have accepted that you will be having a commissioned scrutiny meeting to deal with the wider issues. Nothing like this should have been even suggested or approved until after that has happened.
So I think there's a couple of points within that. So I've just had it pointed out to me on page 15. I'd actually flagged it because I didn't understand what the wording meant. So page 15 on the recommendation at bullet point 2A, it says it is recommended that a less restriction is implemented, which I now, in the context of the map, understand to mean a shorter restriction in terms of the double yellow lines and things. I think as an immediate observation I would just make from the chair is that we perhaps just need to be thinking about wording that maybe could be made clearer on when we're making recommendations and resolves, because I think that, as I say, I'd read that and didn't quite understand what the words meant, so I've highlighted it in my pack just to ask for clarity. I think on the second issue around the scrutiny and the bigger picture type thing, we are, as a committee, fully expecting to have that scrutiny. We don't yet have a date in the diary, but that's not because we're not expecting to go ahead with it. I think that the difficulty is that we can't then have a moratorium on everything that happens anywhere in the area, particularly if there are safety issues around it. So I'm not saying that there is or isn't a safety issue. That's something that the committee will have to come to a judgment, and we'll certainly be asking exec member and officers around that particular aspect of it. That's perhaps a point at which we can agree or disagree. But in terms of process and in terms of how things happen going forward, absolutely, I want to see everybody sticking to the points of the concessions that were made on the 9th of May, because if we don't, then it's meaningless. And I think that's sort of the point that you're making. But that doesn't mean that we can then say no decision on anything will ever be made until that scrutiny has happened, because there may be issues for which, as I've said, that it's a safety issue, or it's an issue for which, scrutiny can only ever make a recommendation. We can't enforce anything. So even if we came out with some stuff from that scrutiny, we're potentially then having to make recommendations to executive or exec members to implement any decisions. Councillor Waters, and then
one quick point, because you've mentioned safety a few times there. Just to be clear, both of us as ward councillors, and I think virtually all the residents down there and anybody that uses the road as a driver will tell you there's no safety problem at those locations. And you put the double yellow lines there and force the cars further down, you will create a worse problem.
Yeah, that's noted. Councillor Norman.
Thank you. Yeah, two things. Just quickly on the Moore Avenue and Osbaldwick Lane Junction. I would say, although I appreciate your comments, Councillor Rowley, I approach this with a very open mind as a ward councillor. I welcome all thoughts and views on it to help make me my mind up. So if you do have any comments, please do make them. Don't not make them for my sake, because it would be very helpful. And just secondly, that there seemed to be some implication that this issue around parking on the other junction was the cause of a single HMO property, or the cause of people parking there to travel to university for a different purpose. And I just wanted to get clear where the main issue rose, because it seems to me those are two different problems. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So it just with regards to the Moore Avenue, I know it's kind of lumped in with this calling, but it's not an issue for us. What I would say, where the difference in Moore Avenue, because you could argue if you're going to put double yellows on that Moore Avenue junction, why shouldn't you put them on Cavendish? The difference is on the Moore Avenue junction, you'll know this yourself, Councillor Norman, as well, Councillor Norman, it's directly opposite Osbaldwick School. And so the issue for Moore Avenue is a very different issue, because you've got school traffic that parks there irresponsibly and dangerously. You know, a drop off in the morning and then again in the afternoon at pickup. As a resident of Broughton Way, which is just down from Moore Avenue, you know, we get the kind of the push on to us. So we're very much aware of what happens along that particular stretch. So that's why the Moore Avenue junction, having the implementation of double yellow lines, is probably more of a corrected decision than it would be on Cavendish Grove and Tranby Avenue. And then to answer your second point, I wanted to be very careful with my wording and not kind of tie everybody with the same brush. The HMO is a student house, and again, I have no issues generally with HMOs being used for students. I'm not going to kind of battle against anybody in that particular regard, but there are students in that particular first house, and they were parking very, very inconsiderately in terms of churning the verge of power. Public speaker referred to it, and even to the point where I actually went and had a chat to them as the ward council was given assurances that they would park sensibly, and they didn't. And so that was the conversation around that. But the parking along Tranby Avenue and into Cavendish Grove predominantly are people who will park there for the day. So they'll come first thing in the morning, they'll leave their car all day, they'll get the bus into wherever they're going to go, and predominantly it's the university. And again, I want to be very careful with my wording. Predominantly it's the university, but I don't want to kind of bring a slur on students or staff, whatever it might be. And so what we tend to find is that at weekends and at holiday times, there's far less of an issue of parking in those particular areas, and so, you know, to the implementation of double yellow lines, again, I do feel that the implementation of double yellow lines is just a knee-jerk reaction to something that actually needs a much bigger solution and a much more of a consultative solution to get us to where we need to be. And simply to put double yellow lines in would not solve any problems that we would perceive. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, I've not seen anybody else indicating any further questions. So for now, I'll say thank you very much to Councillor Waters and Councillor Rowley. There will be an opportunity later on in the process for one of you to come back once you've heard the next part of the meeting. So if one or both of you can stick around, and then I will invite Councillor de Gorn as the exec member for transport to come to the table and just set out the position as you see it, and as with Councillor Rowley and Councillor Waters, you have up to 10 minutes to address the committee, although I'm hoping that it might not take the full 10 minutes.
I'll need that long, but I think obviously quite a lot of ground has already been covered by the contributions, but obviously we'd like to set out a little bit of a context. So firstly, I want to thank the officers for the time that they spent consulting with residents, assessing parking situations and working out the proposals that you've been discussing. And obviously, as you might have overheard in the conversations earlier, this is in the context of 60 or 70 locations across the city that they have to deal with to try and address parking issues, on a regular basis to respond to the situation that we face across the city. So as explained in previous call-ins, I have responded to the petition that followed on from implementing residents' parking scheme, which was, as you've heard described, the outcome of perfectly legitimate campaigning by Badger Hill residents to address university staff and student commuter parking. So that was all part of the planning consent agreed in order to meet the concerns of residents in the immediate area around the Heslington East campus when that development was approved. And I'm sure the ward councillors at the time would have had some involvement in ensuring that that was one of the planning conditions that applied to the neighbouring area. I won't go into the full detail, but as you'll be aware, the part of the condition was a regular survey of surrounding streets to identify if displacement parking was happening. And at a certain trigger point, then there was a requirement for the university to fund residents' parking to respond to that. And that's the process that went through for us to arrive at that decision. So in the decision on the 17th of May, officers reflected on the consultation responses, and as you've heard in the sort of detailed description, recommended lesser restrictions for the Cavendish Grove and Tranby Avenue Junction as compared to what was advertised, as you see in referenced on page 24. And that was the decision that I took on the basis of their advice to apply what's described as junction protection only to ensure the safety of road users in that immediate location. But in particular also, I was to note any concerns that might have arisen for car users living in Cavendish Grove. Now we've heard a response from the residents of Cavendish Grove. I'm not entirely clear from the conversation that's just happened to what extent they were aware that the proposal is quite limited to 10 metres in from the junction, rather than, as was described by one of the public speakers, as halfway down Cavendish Grove. With reference to Moor Lane and Osbaldwick Lane Junction, which, as you've heard some reference to being near to a school, again, my decision session last week did respond to a petition from residents asking for action to address parking on the full length of Osbaldwick Lane, where it was agreed in that decision session last week that highways officers and community officers should work together to identify solutions that might meet the concerns of residents. So that sits alongside the actual junction protection proposal, which is being called in. And I did, in the decision session last week, agree that this would obviously need to take account of the outcome of the call-in today. So,
sorry, Andy, I'm just going to pause you because I'm conscious that Councillor Holly has just left the room. I'm assuming it's a comfort break, but because we're hearing evidence, I don't want the committee to continue and then make a decision when there's members that haven't heard everything that's been said.
I'll try and backtrack if it reoccurs.
Sure. Just I think probably the simplest thing I just note at this point, if anybody else needs to nip to the loo in the next short while, if you could perhaps just take this opportunity. I won't have a proper adjournment, but I'll just have a couple of minutes break. Right, I think everybody's back. So as you were, Councillor de Grauw.
Okay, thank you. So I was just making reference to the situation with Moor Lane and Osbaldwick Lane Junction, and the fact that in my decision session last week, which considered a petition from residents, I assume in that area, asking for action to address parking for full length of Osbaldwick Lane. And the recommendation which was agreed was that highways and community officers should work together to identify solutions that might meet the concerns of residents. And in doing so, I did say that that would need to take account of the fact that there is this decision today which might have a bearing on that process. But certainly I would hope, whatever the outcome today, that will be followed through as a way of addressing some of the concerns for the Moor Lane and Osbaldwick Junction. And just, I did prior to this meeting take the opportunity to have a quick look on Google Street View, and as it happens, there's an image from 2016 with two cars parked nearly completely blocking the pavement quite close to the junction, and a small child on a bicycle round the corner, which I can share with committee if they want to see some idea of the sort of issues that junction protection might be trying to address from a safety point of view. So whilst I would very much hope the work with university could bring about the desired reduction in parking in the immediate area, I'm also mindful of the fact that introducing double yellow lines is, as I've referred to, is part of a process that's going on across the whole city to address immediate safety concerns, and in part because we minimise costs by taking forward batches of restrictions together, both for advert, which is what happened in this case, and then for implementation. So clearly with the summer university holidays, I'd want to ensure that this opportunity is taken to allow the much lesser restrictions that have been identified for Cavendish Grove to go in to be put in place prior to September, rather than facing the situation come September that the residents say, oh, the students and staff are all back now. We've reflected on it. We decided now we do need these WO lines and start the whole process all over again. So that would be my concern about not implementing the lesser restrictions which were recommended and approved by the decision session. So I think that in conclusion, there is a risk that the dangerous corner parking would start again in the autumn, repeating those hazards and pressures, whether it's for the police or for the civil enforcement officers, if those measures are not put in place to prevent that from happening.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll invite members to ask any questions. Just quickly before I do that, I'm just wondering, at least as a very first step within any of this, if this decision were to be upheld and the WLOs are going to go in, presumably the same residents who received a consultation letter could also have a letter that sets out clearly where the lines are going to go in before they actually do go in, if there's clearly been a lesser set of restrictions that are due to be implemented. Because I think one of the things that seems to me quite clear is that there hasn't perhaps been quite clarity over what decision has been made and is going to be implemented versus the restrictions as they were originally consulted upon. So I think whatever the outcome, that would be perhaps a good thing to undertake. I think I would like to just ask you a couple of questions, because obviously it's been raised by both of the calling in members, having been clear that we're not talking about the wider context and the decisions and concessions that were made on the 9th of May. I think it would be helpful just to understand from your perspective what has happened so far, and acknowledging that it's a part of an ongoing process. And it would also be helpful just to understand from your perspective what input you've had from the ward councillors in terms of your actual decision that you took on the 17th of May.
Well, I'm aware that the ward councillors have expressed concerns about the fact that this decision was flying in the face of the previous decision, if you like, to try and involve the university and Archbishop Holgate. I think trying to look from an objective point of view, measures to discourage displacement parking are things which obviously we can work with the university and the school and any other sort of attractors that are causing that parking. But the bottom line has to be that whilst the parking still continues, that we need to ensure that it's done in as safe a manner as possible. And I also accept the argument about displacement further down the road, which was why I was happy to support the officer's recommendation of a lesser restriction that was actually advertised. Obviously, those residents who responded to the consultation would have seen the letter which was circulated in January with the full restrictions on Tranby Avenue and responded accordingly. But the process is that at that meeting, and then you've got the report which sort of summarises some of the responses from residents prior to that decision. The decision took account of those. It's not a referendum, so it's not a case of just counting how many felt for and against. It's weighing up the concerns of residents, any specific requirements. So if it was a sort of, say for example, there was a resident with a disability that lived on the corner, or whatever, those factors would be taken into account before deciding on the restrictions that were put forward. And the restrictions that were put forward were the lesser corner protection to limit the displacement as much as possible, while still ensuring safety for pedestrians and those driving in and out of the junction.
Thank you. That's helpful to have you explain on the specific decision on this particular junction. Just to pull you back to the other point though, and as I say, I'm wanting to be clear, it's not part of this call-in as such, but I think it would be helpful just to understand where we are currently with, you know, any discussions that have begun with, I think we talked about Archbishop Holgate, we talked about a travel plan for the University of York, consultation with the Students' Union and ward councillors.
Well,
can you
yeah, I mean,
just tell us where we are with
I've
any
not
of that?
personally been involved in those. Obviously, you can put that question to the officers when it comes to that point in the meeting. But you know, obviously, a lot of what I do is focused on upcoming decisions and preparing and understanding those. But certainly, as you'll have gathered from the concession in the first place, is very supportive, the notion of trying to address the source of the problem rather than simply adding more yellow lines.
Okay, well, I think I take your point, and I'll ask officers just to note that question as well. I will want to understand a little bit more on that. I think the only comment I would perhaps make is that I think as exec member for transport, and given what a big issue this clearly is, I think it would be probably reasonable to expect that you would be following up on our committee and be actually going and actively saying to the officers, what are you doing to follow up on this? So if you haven't done that already, if I could politely ask you to do that on behalf of both the committee and the ward councillors.
Happy to do that. I would say that I do, or have for the last year or so, attended the Good Neighbours group of the university. I think the whole road ward councillors have been involved with that for some time, but I'm relatively new attending those, and a number of issues such as, well, in fact, I suppose I first started when it was discussing the Badger Hill situation, and discuss that with the university through that channel. Yeah. But I think it's also fair to say that, I mean, there were some comments about meetings and door knocking and so on, and obviously that's the bread and butter of a ward councillor, but the executive member doesn't really have the opportunity to go across the whole city to talk to everybody, but I'm happy to do that, you know, if there are specific questions as they arise, as we're doing now.
Yeah, okay, noted. So I'll throw it open to the rest of the committee for questions. I see Councillor Musson raise their hand.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, a point and then a question, I think, just to confirm, although it's not about Badger Hill, that obviously myself and Councillor Norman are ward councillors for the ward that Archbishop Holgate School and the University of York are in, and we haven't had, I guess, progress on this action from that perspective. And then the question is that I take it that you'll look forward to the invitation of a public meeting and that you'll be glad to attend as soon as you can, as soon as the invitation lands in your inbox, because I think clearly the residents are very keen to speak to you, but if it's the responsibility of the ward councillors to organise, then I'm sure they'll get right on that. So are you happy to go and meet with the residents as soon as is convenient?
I'm certainly happy to meet with residents, but as you say, I think, you know, it's not just looking at the micro situations. You have to reflect on the residents. I mean, I would want to avoid one group of residents being pitched against another, but as executive member, you have to take into account the wider picture, not just the immediate concerns of the residents directly affected on that cul-de-sac.
Okay, Councillor Norman.
Thank you. Yeah, I kind of wanted to go back to the objection submitted, and I appreciate what you're saying, that the kind of lesser restriction was a push towards attempting to compromise. I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, but that seemed to be kind of what you're saying. But it does seem to me that most of the objections that were received were about the concept of WLO lines in this area rather than specifically the extent. I just wonder if you could comment on that.
think, I mean, I can understand that if you live in an area which has not previously had a sort of a parking problem to the extent that is now being experienced, then it is something which you would not be particularly keen to see happen. But I'm aware also, as you no doubt will discuss with officers, there's a limited scope within what we can implement in terms of the tools to address inconsiderate parking. And you've heard, obviously, there is a police response, but inevitably, quite rightly, they don't want to be spending and haven't got the resources to spend all their time going around enforcing against people parking in silly places and causing hazards by doing so, even whether there are W lines or not. But the tools that the council has through civil enforcement are down to imposing waiting restrictions, loading restrictions, or a residence parking scheme. And so that's really what that's how we've come to this position in the first place, is that those were the only tools available to address the situation in Badger Hill. And now that situation, as you say, has moved on. But ultimately, the solution lies in behaviour change with the people who are parking there. If they're catching the bus, as one person described, then logically it'd be better if they were catching the bus from home rather than driving half a way there before they catch the bus. Or alternatively, using other means of transport.
Is that supplementary, Councillor Musson? Because if not, I've got Councillor Pearson waiting. But
it is. I think we should just get away from this. One of the things you just said is, oh, well, it's the responsibility of the person and we just have to hope that they change their behaviour. But I think the point that perhaps the calling members are trying to make is that part of that longer review would be to enable you as executive member for transport to use all the powers of our disposal, not just in terms of parking restrictions, but to address maybe the impact that poor bus services have on those behaviour choices. And I think that would be the benefit of having that longer term over, as you say, bigger picture conversation rather than the piecemeal approach as you yourself have criticised. So I think maybe acknowledging that we kind of all want the same thing, which is to be able to change that behaviour, but that can only really happen in a longer term conversation with all these stakeholders, as was promised at the previous meeting. So I guess just to express frustration at that comment you just made there, because I think that's what we're all trying to move towards.
Mm-hmm. Couldn't really disagree.
Okay, Councillor Pearson.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you, Councillor de Gorn, for your comment. I suppose a general observation is that a lot of these issues are sort of inconsiderate parking and problem parking on junctions and opposite junctions are actually against the highway code.
Mm-hmm.
And if everyone followed it to the letter, there wouldn't be an issue and there'd be no need for these lines. And I think the other thing another observation I'd make is that you as executive member have to make huge numbers of these decisions about yellow lines hither and yellow lines thither. And it's bound to be that occasionally there'll be some contentious ones. I suppose my question is, do you think, and picking up on the points that the calling in members have made, do you think we have a robust enough process for making sure we are making the right decisions when it comes to all these sort of minutiae of sort of transport planning?
Well, certainly my experience has been that the officers will go and survey, particularly if a resident or a ward councillor raises concern about a certain location, they will have a look at that location at different times or relevant times when it's been drawn to their attention, if say it's outside of school, and then consider what is the appropriate restriction. So obviously outside of school it might be the yellow zigzags or a restricted time only at the school pick up and drop off times, and other places if it's like the university, it's sort of weekday restrictions. So there's different hours and different restrictions. If it's a loading problem, then, you know, on a bus route, it might be loading restrictions. So it's, you know, whatever is most appropriate is what we try to put forward.
Okay, I just have one last question from me. I'm not seeing anybody else indicating with anything else. And it was just to pick up on a point that was made by the second speaker again, actually, Ms. Reynolds, and I think it was also repeated by one of the calling in members about a sense that this could be the first kind of part of a slippery slope towards Res Park in the whole area. And I think, again, you know, my observation would be that we're probably not organised enough actually to have a conspiratorial approach to it. But there is definitely a sense that areas that start to experience parking problems, one of the few tools we have in the kit seems to be Res Park, and then you put it in one place, it creates a problem somewhere else, you put it in, you know, and it knock on. And so I think it is something which does need, again, that sort of bigger picture strategy. And I just wondered if you could sort of give us a brief summary of where your position is and what your thoughts are as exec member for transport on that bigger picture. How are we going to address this issue around, you know, Res Park, the sort of creep of it? Because, you know, whether rightly or wrongly, I think, you know, people will look at Badger Hill and say, well, actually that solves some of the problems there, but it's created a big set of problems over here. And we don't really seem to have anything much to offer other than double yellow lines and Res Park again. And presumably if that happened, it would just create a set of problems further down the line somewhere else. So, you know, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I can reflect on the situation in my own ward, and it's exactly as you describe. And I think one of the approaches that we have tried to take is to consult, as you'll know in South Bank, you know, to consult a much wider area if there's a petition from a particular location. Certainly, since I've been executive member for transport, the survey has been for, but as far as possible, the whole logical neighbourhood rather than just a street that's raised a petition, so we can take a more holistic approach. But inevitably, the difficulty is that the street that's experiencing it firsthand now feels passionate that they need a residence parking scheme, and the streets immediately next to them probably see that as less urgent until such time as the change is made, responding to the level of demand and concern from residents in one location, and then the next street will experience the same pressure and then respond accordingly. You know, that's the situation we're facing, and as far as possible, the approach that's been taken by this authority over, well, at least 20 years to my knowledge, has been to very much involve the residents of an area. It's a mechanism to protect parking for residents from commuter parking or from, you know, whatever the neighbouring from nearby business premises or a school or whatever it might be, that's causing the problem and meaning that they have pressure, which means they can't park on their own street.
Okay, thank you. I think I saw James indicating to come in as well, but I think probably we're kind of at the end of your section now, Councillor de Gorn. So what I'll do is thank you for your time. If you could stick around, because there is that point just to come back and just summarise. But we'll move over to officers now. But James, if you wanted to just pick up on that point to begin with, and then perhaps anything else that you...
I'll wrap it in.
Yeah,
it's probably easier to try and give you a single narrative rather than pick points up and do that. So, as Councillor de Gorn alluded to, we deal with an annual review of double yellow lines, and that will be, for those of you as ward councillors that will have sat through that, is 70, 80 schemes that we go through in detail and we have public speakers about. This is subtly different, and I draw your attention to para 3 on page 16 of the original report, which talks about the safety issues and the fact the bus was having to use the wrong side of the road entering Tranby Avenue. And that was actually something that was brought to our attention by residents of Cavendish Grove. So we dealt with this differently to the normal double yellow line requirements because there was an absolute safety issue that we felt needed to be carefully considered. I do accept that this was at the same time, this complaint came in at roughly the same time that the Badger Hill scheme went live. And that is, for those that don't know, is a residence parking scheme funded, at least for a period of time, by the university. That same system could work for Tranby Avenue in that area. So part of the deal with the university is to survey the streets, to assess the impact from the university, and if the parking pressure from the university is considered to meet a threshold, then a res park scheme could be implemented here at the cost of the university. So that is part of the way, and we talked about this on the call-in last time round. So in response to that, officers hand-delivered the letter that's in your packs. The call-in on the 9th of May is referenced in this decision paper. So at para 5, we did reference that there was a related call-in, and that was there. Between the 9th of May and I think it was the 17th of May, we obviously didn't have time to implement all those actions from those concessions that were made on the 9th of May. But I want to assure everyone around the table that they are in the work plan. I know they're in the work plan because I made sure they were. I can't say they've all happened, but I don't think we were set a timeline of when we must do them by. Just looking at the options that are presented to the executive member, option 1 is to implement the restriction as proposed, and option 2 is to implement a lesser restriction. And I accept there's a typo that the word lesser should have been carried across to the recommendation, but we did present options of, as proposed, a lesser, which was just to protect the junctions, and a do nothing, take it away option. I think just to pick up on the sort of the way the session went, we obviously had representations both for and against, both in terms of public speakers at the decision session and in terms of the written representations to the statutory consultation. Councillor Rowley and Waters both spoke at that decision session, and I think in fairness to Councillor Gorney, obviously listened to that, because if you look at the resolution on page 13 of your packs, it talks about exploring possibility of restrictions to maintain safety at the bus stop further up the street, which was actually an issue some of the residents and indeed Councillor Rowley had raised and asked Councillor de Gorn to consider. That wasn't in the recommendations we made, that was in response to what happened at the meeting. So ultimately the safety risk can remain the police's concern in terms of them enforcing it. We have actually spoken to the police about this point of what enforcement they've done in Osbaldwick, and they have apologised and said they don't have any record of enforcing obstructive parking in Osbaldwick this calendar year. And we can share that with the committee, that email, if you want. I think ultimately this is about, if the parking restrictions are purely to enforce the highway code, which is what the junction restrictions are, the question I think really is whether the council want to take ownership of that problem and put double yellow lines in so that we can actively take control of it, or do you want to leave it with the police to enforce through the highway code, which we can't do. And I think in essence that's where the decision making lay, in terms of if there is a safety issue here, how do you want to deal with it? And as I say, that safety issue was reported to us by the residents of Cavendish Grove originally. I think I probably, is there anything you want to add?
Okay, that's really helpful. I see that there's two hands gone up immediately. I'm just going to ask a quick technical question first. So we've gone to junction protection. The junction with Cavendish Grove is 10 metres around. The junction at Hull Road is longer than that, I think, isn't it? 20 metres.
Yeah.
So is the reason for that, well, what's the reason for the longer restriction at that junction?
Obviously the original complaint, one of the residents, was that a bus couldn't get into, so we wanted to make sure there was clear distance for any buses accessing to have clear view, and due to the bend coming off the roundabout you need to make sure that the visibility was there, so that was why we went for the 20 metres.
Thank you. And one of the hopefully quick technical question, is there any obligation on you as officers if there is a safety issue that's raised? Presumably, you know, somebody says there's a safety issue, there may or may not be, but if you assess it and you ascertain that you believe that there is a safety issue, does it still remain a decision that essentially a politician can choose to make, or is there a point at which you are actually obliged to act on a particular issue, and would this meet a threshold if there were such a threshold?
I don't think we've got to that point, is the honest answer. So the normal approach is, particularly where they are differing views, and clearly when you see the consultation results come back, there are a range of views about those restrictions. Our normal approach then is to put that to the executive member to make, or the executive indeed sometimes, to make those decisions where it's not clear cut. I can take decisions if they are relatively uncontroversial. If the executive member made a decision to ignore a safety issue, then potentially yes, you know, we're not in that case here, but potentially then yes, I would say, you know, I think there's a real safety risk here, but I would probably want more evidence to be able to overturn an executive member decision than is in front of us here.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful. So I saw Councillor Hollier first and then Councillor Norman.
My question was basically your first question. It seems like the 10 metre is a bit of a no-brainer really. Nobody should be parking there anyway. So what this all boils down to is whether there should be an additional 10 metres along Tranby Avenue. It sounds like that's necessary for the bus, but ultimately that's what this entire meeting boils down to really.
Yes, in essence, I think that's the point.
Councillor Norman.
Hello, yep, just a point and a question, if that's all right. Just quickly on the comment about the university being potentially, this is being within the 106 agreement area thing. I think it should be fair, if the good people of Tranby Ave were minded to go down this route, it did take us about 7 years to get the Badge Hill in place, and the 106 arrangement runs out in 2024. So I think that the likelihood of that being a possibility, if they wished it to be a possibility, is quite slim. On more of a question, I guess it would be useful to know, clearly there's quite a strong divide between objections and comments and support. Is that normal? Do we often see that? Can you give me a sense?
So just on the first point, a survey was undertaken of this area in March as part of that Section 106 university scheme. And whilst I accept the point you make, I think proving the principle also has now taken place, and sometimes those first wins are the hardest ones. Yes, it is not unusual for the executive member for transport to have the most public speakers at their sessions. They are, very, divisive issues in communities about what is the right thing to do, and there isn't sometimes a right and a wrong answer. And actually, the yellow lines that are related to parking pressure and not safety are even harder on that because there is less of a rationale. This one, naively, I thought was less controversial because it was directly linked to what was reported to us as a safety issue.
Okay, Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. Just a few questions to get some clarification on a few points. So who actually submitted the request that triggered the review that then led to the initial recommendation? So it'd be helpful to understand what the trigger for all of this was. I know as a ward councillor, sometimes we will request things, sometimes residents request things, and it appears on the list. You think, oh, that's a surprise. I'd never thought there was an issue there, but clearly someone thinks there is, and it's investigated, and sometimes it's rejected because there's no apparent reason why. So it'd be helpful to understand what the prompt was. From what you were saying about the safety concerns, am I right in thinking that they relate solely to the Tranby Avenue Hull Road roundabout junction and the bus having to turn off? I'm guessing the bus is turning into Tranby Avenue from the roundabout and having to drive on the wrong side of the road because of the cars that are immediately parked there. If I'm right about that, then is the Cavendish Road Junction WL lines, are they well, while we're doing that, we may as well do this as well. Was there a separate complaint from a resident specifically highlighting safety concerns at that junction? And final question, as and when double yellow lines are advertised and a decision is made, is there a time limit in which those have to be installed? Thank you.
So the initial representation came from several different residents of Tranby Avenue and Cavendish Grove, who were feeling there was issues with parking and increasing parking. So one of the residents of Cavendish Grove that raised the issue about the bus not being accessed also raised concerns about blue light service being able to access Cavendish Grove. And there was also reports from residents of Cavendish Grove that the refuge vehicles couldn't get into the street because of the amount of vehicles parked there. And that resulted in some miscollections. And with regards the time limit, we have to have implemented in 2 years after the approval. Yeah.
I should add, we aim to do it quicker than that.
Okay, can't see any further questions. The one other, sorry, I do have, in fact, 2 other questions just from the public speakers. The second speaker suggested that double yellow lines are irreversible. I don't know whether that's correct or not. If you can put them in, you can take them out.
Yeah, you can revoke restrictions. You can take them out in a couple of years but if we're going to put them in for safety grounds, I'm not sure how we'd say in 2 years. There's no longer a safety issue.
Okay. And then the first public speaker made a point around the original plans with the university not having any mention of pay to park on the university site. I think probably that's not something that we can really get too far into in this meeting, unless you sort of happen to know, you know, if there's anything sort of immediately obvious that you could comment on that. But I didn't want to lose that point as it had been raised.
No, I think it's part of that ongoing piece of work with the university that we've committed to, is to explore how we can maximise the permissions they have got, how we maximise the use of those to limit the impact on, obviously, the amount that the planning committee did give them permission for, and from memory it capped it with a condition. You know, if we've agreed to that many, then we obviously want them optimised for use, and that's part of that discussion with the university.
Okay, thank you. In which case, thank you both for being present to answer questions. And what I'm going to do now is, this is where we depart from where we have ordinarily been within these meetings, and move into the new realm of the new way of doing call-ins, which is to invite the calling in members. If one of you would like to come to the committee, if there's any points that have come up, or if you want to just make a summary of your position, and it is a time limited thing, so it's a maximum of 5 minutes. Councillor Waters.
Thank you, Chair. I apologise again because this is going to take longer than what I originally thought. I was just going to sit here and say that, as what I said earlier, you should be rejecting all this tonight until such time as they've complied with the earlier call-in concessions that haven't taken place, and I'm sure it's clear to you all that they haven't. But there's a few things that need clarifying. James Gilchrist mentioned, well, I think everybody's mentioned the word safety all the time, but he specifically mentioned the safety of the buses and the bus having to go on the verge to actually get through the traffic. That is a problem that happens much further down Tranby Avenue, and it'll be a problem that's made even worse by these double yellow lines if they're introduced, because traffic will be just displaced to the area where safety is a concern. Darren Hobson mentioned a bus turning off Hull Road and down Tranby Avenue. I'd just like to ask him which bus that is, because the bus that uses Tranby Avenue the most, the number 6 route, doesn't use that route. Number 20 does, but that's very infrequent. It was also mentioned that the police had no record of action taken. Well, I'll produce the photographs of the police actually in action, and I can produce the emails when Inspector Poynton was sending officers out. They maybe haven't issued fines, but they've asked cars to move. There was one resident in particular on the corner of Cavendish Grove who had a car dumped outside his front for days on end, and the police actually sorted that for him. And I've got all the records of that. We had it mentioned by Councillor Hollier that parking on the junction of Tranby Avenue and Hull Road being a main road was a no-brainer. It certainly is. You would not, in any normal circumstances, find anybody parking there. But this one student HMO, where there's parking for 2 cars on the driveway, insists on having 1 car on the drive and 1 half on the verge on the road. That can be dealt with in another way by putting a couple of planters on the verge, as you'll see in some of the residents' comments. There's absolutely no need for double yellow lines to be implemented there for the sake of one property that hasn't got the brains to park on the driveway that's available. Now, safety's been mentioned umpteen times throughout all this, so I'm really grateful that Mr. Macy's actually been here, because he's reminded me of a North Yorkshire Police FOI that he put in probably about 4 years ago in relation to a completely different, unrelated matter, when he'd asked for the list of all the accidents around junctions in Osbaldwick, and he was told that from 1954 to, I think it was 2018, he put his request in, there'd been none. So again, summing up very quickly, my conclusion with this, as I've said before, if I was sat around this table, I would not be accepting this situation. You should be upholding those concessions that were made on the 9th of May that you all accepted, and none of this should take place pending the meeting that you're supposed to be convening in 6 months. So again, I would take issue with James Gilchrist when he says there's no timeline for these meetings to look at a solution in the wider context. There is, because you've set a timeline of 6 months for a meeting of this scrutiny committee to discuss all this in the round. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And so there's no provision for questions, but I appreciate your summary there. And so, Councillor de Gorn, if you want to make any final points and summarise anything, now's your opportunity. And again, you have a maximum of 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I think the key points have probably come out in the sense that we have limited capacity as to what we can do as an authority to tackle the parking as been experienced, but we have, as you said, got concessions which we'll work through with the university and with Scrutiny to look at those softer measures to try and address the problem. But the decision that was taken, as has been made clear, was very much a reduction on the original advertised proposal. As you've heard, 10 metres on just immediately on the corner of Cavendish Grove and Tranby Avenue. And though there hasn't been so much discussion about it, I think even one of the calling members did say that they could well understand the concerns about Moore Avenue and Osbaldwick Lane being close to a school and the sorts of problems there. Probably more significant from a safety point of view because of the fact that there will be children who are walking or cycling to and from the school being picked up and potentially having to cross that junction, whether it's to go home or to catch the bus. That protection would be to improve the safety. We don't, certainly personally speaking, I don't want to wait for accident statistics. Quite often we're critical of the fact that we're advised there's no need for us to do something because there hasn't been an accident. We have to prioritise junctions where there has been an accident, or we don't want to have to wait for that. I would very much prefer to see the limited restrictions that have been recommended by officers in put in place and ensure people are safe, whatever means of transport that they are using on our roads. So with that, I would recommend, as has been suggested, that there aren't grounds for calling. We have got the further actions has been referred to in the concession, which can sit alongside these restrictions, which are much less than was actually advertised in the first place.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. So we now move into the sort of final phase of this meeting. Now, this is where we're going to have to do something slightly different than we will be doing going forward, because we currently only have the two options A and B, as we previously would have done. Going forward, what we will be receiving is essentially a sheet with a series of boxes potentially ticked to say breaches, and so we would be looking through each of those, looking at whether or not we think that there are breaches made. Now, unfortunately, the council constitution, the decision was taken at that point that we would still only have a single vote on all of those, and that, in my view, would set us up in a slightly awkward situation if this was the call-in being done in that way, because I think we've heard that one of the decisions seems to be no real contest on, and the other one, there does seem to be some issues around safety and whether or not we think it's acceptable or not. And obviously, if we only had one vote on all of it, as we do this evening, then you either have to say that it all falls or it all is upheld. That's perhaps a conversation that we might want to come back to at some point further down the line. But for the point of this evening's meeting, we are looking at those two options, A and B. I am going to be asking you each to just very briefly set out what your reasons for why you want to support one or the other are. And just before we do that, I think I will just note that we have had the exec member saying that he'd be happy for a letter to go out to the residents as were originally consulted, just making it very clear to them what the new restrictions, the lesser restrictions are. So if we could do that, that would be great. And I think the other point that I would make is just to reiterate to both the exec member and to officers that the concessions that were made on the 9th of May, I think, were important. And I think it is really important that we have a meaningful engagement around the travel plan. My intention is to bring that back to scrutiny within the next 6 months. That's linked to the forward plan and an executive decision as well, I believe. So we do just need to make sure the timing of that is right. But I would like us to be discussing something meaningful with some progress at that meeting. So I'm just putting that out to you both in that context. I think, just in the interest of fairness, what I'll do is I'll ask a couple of you down this side and then a couple of you down this side and then the other two. And as Vice Chair, Councillor Fenton, I'm gonna go to you first to set out where you are on this.
Okay, thank you, Chair. It's been, I think our understanding has evolved during the meeting as to what exactly has been agreed and was agreed at the decision session and why. There doesn't seem to be any dissent as to the fact that where the lesser proposals are recommended, people shouldn't be parking there. That seems to me fairly clear. The issue at hand seems to be a dislike for double yellow lines as a concept, as an approach for discouraging people from parking inappropriately, or as a Trojan horse for a res park scheme. And I'm really struggling to recommend referral back to executive on those grounds, because I disagree with that premise. I don't believe, and think of examples in my own ward, double yellow lines in many cases try and resolve an issue before it gets to a res park stage, and I don't personally have a problem with double yellow lines as a concept. I know aesthetically they're not particularly attractive, although York has primrose rather than the kind of harsher yellow that you see in other cities. So I'm kind of minded to support option A, which is not to refer back.
Thank you very much. Councillor Pearson, go to you next.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to the calling members, officers, and executive member. I think I'm probably minded to agree that there aren't strong grounds to bring this back to executive for discussion. I think I broadly agree with what's been decided, and I guess coming from a bit of a railway background myself, safety first principle, and I think I'd like to see the room for the bus being able to get through on that junction, especially as it's coming off a two-lane dual carriageway. You don't want anything backing up onto the roundabout. So I guess that's why I see no reason to call us in.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to Councillor Norman next.
Thank you. Just to begin on the Moor and Osbaldwick Junction, I think I find myself in the unusual circumstance of agreeing with both Councillor Rowley and Councillor Waters to an extent, and in that clearly something more holistic needs to happen, a sticking plaster to try and resolve the colossal parking issues on Osbaldwick Road's pavements clearly needs to happen. But I think I also concur with Councillor Rowley's comments about the school opposite. So I think I would err on that side on that particular case. The other issue to me seems a difficult one, because essentially we are trying to balance the considered officer view of safety and the clear view of the local community. I wonder if further consultation on the smaller scale might be fruitful. If a conversation at a consultation stage is had with residents about those smaller extents of double yellow lines, would there be any difference in reaction to local residents? And I think I would be interested to see if there would be. And I think the letter from residents that we've had suggests that maybe there wouldn't. So I'm quite on the fence, but I think I'm leaning towards B, on the grounds that we would go for a further consultation with residents just on a smaller scale scheme and see what the feeling on the ground was. Because with these sorts of schemes, buy-in from local communities is essential. And without that, yeah, I think we struggle.
Thank you. Councillor Musson.
Thanks, Chair. I would broadly agree with already made comments. I think it's not for us to state whether we, not being mind readers, think that there's a grand scheme to introduce Res Park. And in terms of the objections given, I think Councillor Rowley said himself that it makes no difference if there's another team to enforce something that the police is already enforcing. As Councillor Waters has said, he's called the police out multiple times. So as long as the introduction of double yellow lines doesn't stop the ability to do that, which I've heard no reason why it would, I wouldn't see the reason to call in the whole decision. But I am, I guess, still a bit concerned as to how the ward councillors and the residents had a different understanding of what the agreed on decision was to what it, we've discussed it is tonight. So perhaps this probably isn't recommendation, but for officers or the exec member to reflect on communications. And he's already said he will write to the residents, but perhaps we could, in light of the already agreed on holistic view that we've agreed to take forward, that if there are any smaller schemes, that are brought in on matters of safety in the meantime, that we are sure to do extra communications to residents, particularly if they come up in this area, so that they understand that this is not a walk back of those previously agreed decisions to have a review and to take that into account, but that this is of a separate issue and limited, and make sure that we're very clear about the confines of each decision, because clearly, rightly or wrongly, several members of the public weren't up to date with what the decision was, and that can only be a failing of our communications given the scale of misunderstanding. So to reflect on that.
Thank you. Councillor Fisher.
Thank you, Chair. The highway code is pretty clear. You can't park within close proximity to a junction. I'm sure a lot of drivers know that, but they ignore it. And I feel the police have a lot better things to do than enforcing these, because it's a police matter to enforce inconsiderate parking. And I feel due to the lack of resources, which we see all over where we can't get the police to come out to serious incidents, I think they've got better things to do. WL is a visual reminder as well. They remind you, everyone knows WL lines, you don't park on them. They're there, you can see them. And the other thing about enforcement of WL lines is it's done in-house. We have the traffic enforcement officers and we can send them out to do a blitz. We've done this in Strensall, in my ward, and it worked. I take issue with Councillor Waters' view there is a no safety issue at the Tranby Avenue Hull Road roundabout. I have a very recent personal experience of having to wait on the dual carriageway roundabout to enter Tranby Avenue, in fact just last week, due to cars parked on the corner, and it's not the first time. My son has a business about a mile away and I travel down there a lot. There is a safety issue, and I therefore see no reason why we shouldn't put WL lines on these specific junctions, and I should be supporting option A.
Thanks. And Councillor Hollier.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, happy to support option A. We seem to have had a 2-hour meeting about whether we should paint 10 sort of extra meters of double yellow lines, which I think is probably a sort of new low for this committee. Yeah, the only possible thing I can think of is maybe sort of a little map in the report showing where sort of a change is proposed. And then perhaps people that don't want to read the report can look at the map. That's all I've got to say.
Thank you very much, Councillor Hollier. I think I'd like to think that there was a little bit more than just the 10 metres, because I think that there was a discussion around safety in general on all of it. However, I think that for what it's worth, from my point of view, we're looking at whether or not a process has been followed correctly and whether or not a decision has been made reasonably. And I think that the view that I would take is that there has been an opportunity for the ward councillors to speak at the decision session and those views be articulated and be taken on board by the executive member. The executive member has been given advice from officers and has acted accordingly, has made amendments to his decision. So in that sense, I have no problem with the decision as it's made. And I think, you know, that's democracy. And if you don't like the decision of the democratic decision maker, then you can choose to elect a different democratic decision maker at another stage. I do think, however, that it has highlighted some ongoing issues that I do think we all need to be mindful of. I think there is an issue around consultation in general. If people feel that consultation is just here's what we're going to do, and then we're going to do it, that's not really consultation, that's a broadcast. And I think we do need to continually be working on how we're engaging both with ward councillors, with the executive, and then residents with ward councillors to make sure that we are having a conversation. That conversation is also two-way. And I think that the point was made on this, that when you are consulting on traffic regulations, it's not a referendum. It is about saying, these are the ideas that we're thinking of doing. How can we try to address a problem, and how can we come up with the solution that we think works with everybody? It's not simply actually, do you 20 people or 15 or 100 or however many it is want to vote one way or another. Again, if you want different decision makers, you make those decisions at the ballot box, but ultimately, you know, we're following processes here that hopefully give you opportunities to input, and those views hopefully are taken into account. And if a decision is different than what you want to see happen, hopefully somebody has explained to you clearly why they've taken the decision that they've taken. The other point that I think is really worth stressing in this, and sorry to go on, I am conscious of time, but the importance of the concessions that were made on the 9th of May, it is really, really important that we stick to those and that we see that there is concrete action. And so I've said it already, but I will say it again. when that does come to scrutiny within the next 6 months, I don't want to be reading about things that we will do. I want to be reading about the things that we have done already and how they're fitting into a strategy for dealing with this problem, because it's not a problem that's going to go away. I have no doubt that Councillor Waters and Councillor Doughty and Councillor Rowley will be absolutely on it, as will, I'm sure, Councillor Norman and Councillor Musson, as it's very close to their wards as well. So I think we do need to be clear about what we're going to do with this big problem, which, as I say, we will get our teeth very much into when it comes to scrutiny next. So I think all I need to do at this point is take a vote based on asking you all to show if you're in favour of option A or option B. And just to be clear, option A is to decide that there are no grounds to make specific recommendations to executive in respect of the decision called in. If this option is chosen, the original decisions taken by the exec member will be confirmed. Or option B is to make specific recommendations to the executive on the decisions called in light of the reasons given for post-decision call-in. And if this option is chosen, the matter will be considered at a meeting of executive calling in. So if I can, or you can abstain. Thank you very much, Janie. It's always important to have that option too. So if I can see all those in favour of option A, if you could show now, please. All those in favour of option B. And there are no abstentions. So that decision is upheld. Councillor Musson.
Could we just, I guess, be clear that in voting for option A, we're doing this on the basis that the executive member has already agreed to write to the residents, and that we've re-ascertained our commitment to this review? Because I think for me, that's why I'm happy to go with option A rather than B, because I don't want to recommend something that we've already agreed to, but just that we're committed to that.
Yeah, no, that's it's a fair point, and we'll make sure that that's clearly recorded in the minutes. Yeah. Okay, so with that, that's the end of our business today. There's no urgent business, so thank you all for your time this evening.